So conveniently next to I Heard You Beat Houses, we have Killers of the Flower Moon, which is Martin Scorsese's next film after The Irishman, which at the time of the making of this video hasn't been released yet. But this is an extraordinary work. It's a very disturbing book. You know, I won't go into the details because of course the film's not out, but the extent of the atrocities that occurred, the bigotry and the just straight up genocide is the correct word to use, that was committed against these Native Americans in the 1920s. You know, it is an ancient history. They received literally no help from Osage country and the authorities in the area. It's a story that really should be made into a film so more people know about it. A very sickening read, a book that makes you feel quite dirty, to be honest. So what else do we have? There's 2 Stephen King books here. So out of all these Stephen King books I've read, I would say this one is probably the best, Pet Sematary. This one actually made me tear up. You know, I was quite emotional reading it. And partly it's because this book is about a father whose 2 or 3-year-old son is killed because he's run over by a truck. And when I was reading this book, I had a 2 or 3-year-old son. And essentially the story is that he learns of a way that he can bring his son back. But when the son does come back, he's not quite right, because of course he's supposed to be dead. And the story essentially goes from there. It's really interesting. The main character is fascinating. And essentially it's, you know, a book where how far would you go to bring someone back, bring a loved one back, even if you knew it was the wrong thing to do. The next best Stephen King book, from what I've read, I haven't read much from Stephen King, is probably Salem's Lot, which isn't here, but I thought that was a really good read. The Shining was also very good. This one, The Gunslinger, is the first in the Dark Tower series. Now, from what I gather, it's considered a kind of slog to get through, and it's considered a kind of necessary evil for fans of the Dark Tower, because this is the one that you have to get into, and then after this the story gets really good, and that's when it starts. And the introduction from Stephen King kind of says something similar, in that you kind of have to bear with this book so that you can enjoy the rest. And I mean, I haven't read the rest yet, but I can definitely agree with that, because I found this quite a chore to get through. It was kind of dire, quite boring. There was hardly any story, and it felt like it was written by a guy who really loved the sound of his own typewriter. Because again, the story is bare bones, but it's so overwritten. You just kind of think after you finished it, okay, what actually was the story here? It feels like the prologue. It feels like an introduction to a story, which I guess is what it is, but you know, on its own, it's not the best of reads. And here we have a book called Easy Riders Raging Bulls, which is written by Peter Biskin, who based the book on interviews he did with many famous Hollywood individuals. It's concerned with the Hollywood New Wave era, which is my favorite era of filmmaking. Guys, pretty much everybody that you can think of related to the Hollywood New Wave is referenced in here. There's anecdotes, stories, direct quotations, interviews, guys like Scorsese, guys like Francis Ford Coppola, guys like Peter Bogdanovich. It's an interesting read. There are some really cool tidbits of information. It's got its highs, but it's also got its lows, because when you're reading it, it does kind of descend into, okay, this guy was sleeping with that girl, and this producer fucked over this actor, and it just kind of goes on, and the impression you get is everybody in Hollywood is a psycho, everybody's messed up, everybody's on drugs, and everybody is an asshole. I read the book with the intention that I was going to see the behind the scenes of, you know, the technical side of filmmaking maybe, or how they set up this shot, or how they approached this actor and got him to star in this movie. You know, interesting things that happen behind the scenes of movies, which this book does contain, but it's mainly a kind of scandal book. It's also been denounced by many of the people who are referenced in it, like William Friedkin and Coppola and all of these people. I mean, it would be, because it paints pretty much everybody in a bad light, so who knows who's telling the truth on that one. So that's pretty much 10 books done. Let's do one more just to close off the video. So let's take a look at this one. Khalid Hosseini's 1,000 Splendid Suns. This is written by the guy who wrote the famous The Kite Runner, which I've yet to read. But this one was an absolutely devastating book. I found it so emotional to such an extent. I was about halfway through the book and I told my wife the story. I told her what the setup was and where it was in the story because it was really interesting. When I finished it, I was so emotionally drained, so devastated, so depressed that I couldn't even bring myself to tell my wife the second half of the story, what actually happened, how it ended, and I still haven't. It's an absolutely devastating book. It's essentially it's focused on two women. First of all, it's focused on a young girl called Mariam. Now, Mariam's mother was the servant in a rich household. Now, the man who was the head of the household, he slept with the servant and they had Mariam. And the man's wife obviously wasn't happy with that, so the servant and her daughter were sent to live in some shack in some really poor, impoverished place, literally away from civilization, really. And she grows up yearning for the days when her dad comes and visits. Her mum is a kind of psycho, she's got a lot of psychological issues. And eventually, unfortunately, her mother dies and she's sent to live with her father. But because of the history of Mariam and her mother and everything, that the father's wives in fact, because he's got multiple wives, are unhappy with Mariam staying. And so she's sent off to marry a guy called Rashid, who's much, much older than her and lives in some faraway town. And so she goes and marries him and she goes and lives in his home. And there are teething issues, but there's a sweetness to the relationship. But over time, it starts to sour, very much so, especially after she fails to have children. And, he starts to abuse her, he starts to hit her and beat her and all this kind of stuff. The second individual followed is Layla, another young girl who, and this is about 20 years later, after Mariam has been in this abusive relationship and is kind of used to it by now. She's accepted her life is going to be like this. But Layla is from a very different kind of background. She's from an educated background. She's got parents who very much want her to be educated. But then a bomb hits, which takes out her entire family. And she's found by Rashid, who basically, mends her body and everything. And an important fact about Layla is that she slept with someone she very much liked who has now left because of all the bombings and the devastation that's happening in Afghanistan. This book is set in Afghanistan, by the way. I should probably said that in the beginning. But she's actually pregnant. So now, in order to protect herself and her baby, when Rashid pops the question, even though she's very young, he's very old, and he's already got a wife called Mariam, she immediately accepts. And then it's basically about the duo's relationship, these two women in the household, this very toxic household, and how they don't like each other. But eventually they kind of get together. They have quite a very sweet and loving relationship, and eventually it becomes a kind of thing where it's him and his abusiveness versus them two. But yeah, I mean, it goes to some really dark places, and it kind of tells the history of Afghanistan, modern day Afghanistan, because that's the backdrop. You've got kind of the Mujahideen, the Taliban, the Russians, all of that kind of stuff. It's all happening in the background. Rashid sees these things on television, and when certain parties take over Afghanistan, the entire atmosphere changes, the town changes, what people can do, can't do changes. That's very interesting. But the core story, the heart of the story, is the story of Layla and Mariam. And it's a very, very heartbreaking tale, an amazing book. And once I read it, I immediately picked up The Kite Runner, because, of course, if that's the book that he's most famous for, then it must surely be worth checking out. So yeah, that's some of the books I've got and some of the books I read. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you do, so I know I'm not just kind of talking to myself here. And let me know if you've read any of these books and what you think of them. So yeah, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and thanks for watching.